The rain was a relentless drum against the roof of the Miller house, a sound that tonight felt like a persistent, dark warning. David Miller sat quietly at the small kitchen table, his face illuminated only by the glow of a single lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the kitchen. His hands were calloused from years of back-breaking labor that seemed to yield less profit every month, and his eyes, once bright with ambition, had grown clouded with cynicism. Across from him, Sarah was busy trying to salvage what was left of their modest dinner before the cold of the blackout set in. She was the light to his shadow, a woman whose heart remained stubbornly open, even as their bank account dwindled. The power had been out for several hours, a casualty of the fierce suburban storm that had isolated their remote home. Suddenly, a heavy pounding on the front door pierced the wind. David froze instantly, his muscles tensing. In this remote area, no one came calling at midnight. Sarah's eyes widened, her hand moving to her chest as she looked toward the dark hallway. When he pulled the door open, the freezing wind rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth. Standing on the porch was a figure that looked like a ghost. He was elderly, his frame bent under the weight of tattered, mud-stained clothes. The beggar's hair was a wild shock of silver, plastered to his forehead by the rain, and his eyes were sunken, but strangely piercing, reflecting the lantern light with a peculiar intensity. "Please," the exhausted man rasped, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "I ask for nothing but a corner to sleep in, just for one night. The frost is coming, and I have nowhere else to go to survive." David's initial reaction was a sharp refusal. He saw not a human in need, but a potential threat, a predator using the storm as a cover for a robbery. He began to close the door, muttering about how they had nothing to share. But Sarah was there in an instant, her hand catching the edge of the door. She saw the man's shivering frame and the desperation in his gaze. Sarah felt a deep, unexplainable urge to help, a feeling that this was not a moment for fear, but for mercy. The rain seemed to intensify, drumming louder against the glass as their voices rose in hushed desperation. An argument erupted between the couple in the shadows of the hallway as they debated the stranger's fate. Finally, a grim compromise was reached. David would absolutely not allow the stranger into the house, but he would permit him to stay in the garage, provided he was gone before sunrise. As Sarah led the man toward the side entrance, she noticed something peculiar. Despite his frailty and the way he shook, the man held a small, ancient-looking wooden box with extreme, almost reverent care, clutching it to his chest as if it were more precious than his own life. His hands were a map of scars and thick calluses, the hands of someone who had known immense labor. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. David watched from the kitchen window as the man settled onto a pile of old blankets in the corner of the garage. He turned the heavy metallic click of the connecting door, or the sound echoing in the silent house. He peered through the small glass pane one last time. The shadowy beggar wasn't lying down. He was standing perfectly still in the darkness, his back to the door. He wasn't looking for things to steal. Instead, his gaze was fixed intently on a yellowed photograph pinned to David's workbench, a picture of the original Miller estate from 50 years ago. The old man stood as motionless as a silent statue, leaving David precisely and quietly wondering who exactly he had just invited into his home. Sarah lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic creaking of the house. Beside her, David's breathing was heavy, the sound of a man haunted by the weight of unpaid bills. Her mind drifted back to the mysterious man in the garage. There was something in the way he had looked at the old photograph, not with curiosity, but with the aching recognition of a ghost returning home. She slipped out of bed. She filled a heavy ceramic bowl with the last remains of the evening's soup and grabbed a thick blanket. The air was frigid, but her heart was firm and resolute. When she pushed open the door, the smell of damp concrete and motor oil greeted her. The old man sat on a pile of pallets, the box in his lap. He didn't look up, yet he seemed to know she was there. Sarah set the soup down and draped the blanket over his thin shoulders. He didn't reach for the food. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the shadows. He spoke of the 1972 rains, how the vast northern pasture flooded before the stone drainage was installed, and the hand-carved oak banister. Sarah froze in her tracks. Those were details lost to time, secrets from a past long buried. "How could you know?" she whispered, her heart hammering. The old man simply smiled knowingly at her, his eyes shining. Before he could answer, the door from the kitchen slammed open. David stood there, hair disheveled and face flushed with fury. He held a heavy iron poker, his knuckles white. Seeing Sarah, he let out a guttural sound of betrayal. He accused the man of spinning lies to ensnare his wife, shouting they had nothing left for a vulture. David's voice echoed off the metal walls, sharp and jagged, filled with the bitterness of his struggling life. The stranger stood up slowly. He reached into the tattered pocket of his coat and pulled out an object that caught the dim light. It was a single gold coin, heavy and ancient. "For the rent," the man said softly, on extending his hand. David's hardened eyes saw only a cruel trick. He slapped the man's hand away, and the heavy gold coin hit the cold concrete with a dull thud. David called it fake brass, meant to buy trust. He ordered Sarah back into the house, his eyes burning with a desperate, protective rage. As Sarah moved slowly toward the heavy door, she looked back. The old man wasn't angry. Instead, a single warm tear rolled down his cheek. It was a tear of profound pity for the man standing before him. "You guard a cage, David," the stranger remarked. "You worry about thieves while the world steals your soul. Remember this: the house knows its true master, and it does not recognize the man who rules it with fear." David sneered, locking the door once more, convinced he was the only one thinking clearly. To ensure the mysterious beggar stayed in his place, David pulled a chair and sat facing the door. He gripped a flashlight, vowing to stay awake until dawn. However, as the minutes ticked by, a strange, unnatural heaviness settled over him. It wasn't normal fatigue. It felt as though the very air had turned to lead. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to stretch and yawn, wrapping around him like a dark, heavy shroud sitting in the shadows. Just as his chin dropped and the flashlight slipped from his numb fingers, a sound drifted through the door. It was a whisper, faint as the rustle of leaves, yet it cut through the silence. The old man was speaking again. He breathed a single name: Alistair. David's heart stopped in his chest. Alistair was his middle name. a name his mother had given him in secret, one he had never shared with anyone in this town, not even Sarah. As the darkness finally claimed him, the mystery grew into a terrifying and silent roar. The morning sun arrived with a blinding, clinical clarity that seemed to wash away the feverish shadows of the previous night. David jolted awake, his mind racing with the haunting echo of that whispered name, Alistair. The storm had retreated, leaving behind a world that felt strangely silent. He scrambled to his feet, fumbling with the heavy locks of the garage door. He expected to find a crime scene or the scent of a stranger's intrusion. Instead, when the door creaked open, he was met with a sight that defied his expectations. The garage was pristine. The oil stains that had marred the concrete for a decade were gone, and the cluttered shelves had been organized with mathematical precision. The air smelled of cedar rather than dampness and decay. The beggar was gone, leaving no physical trace of his presence, save for one thing resting squarely atop the center of the workbench, the small, ancient wooden box. Sarah joined him as they stared at the object in a shared silence. With trembling fingers, David lifted the lid. He half expected to find rags, but his breath hitched as he looked inside. Neatly stacked within were bundles of thick parchment, tied with silk ribbons. There were legal documents bearing embossed seals that David recognized from his brief studies years ago. He pulled out the top parchment. It was an original land deed for the very soil they stood upon, and the thousands of acres surrounding it. And beneath the deeds lay a series of letters addressed to the heirs of the Miller estate. As David read the first few lines, the world tilted on its axis. The man they had treated as a vagabond was not a stranger. He was Elias Miller, David's biological grandfather, the legendary recluse who had vanished decades ago, leaving behind nothing but rumors of a vast fortune and a family tree fractured by bitterness and secrets. The letters spoke of a man weary of success and suspicious of those seeking favor. Elias had spent his final years wandering in disguise, an exile designed to find a heart not corroded by greed. He was looking for the wealth of spirit, a currency far more precious than the gold David had violently rejected. Tucked into the back of the box was a small photograph. It depicted a young man standing in front of the very same house. In his hand, held aloft with a playful glint, was the exact gold coin that David had slapped onto the cold concrete the night before. Seeing the image, David felt a wave of profound shame wash over him. He realized that his hardened heart, his constant suspicion, and his refusal to see the humanity in a broken old man had almost cost him his entire heritage and the future his family needed to survive. Sarah reached out, her hand resting gently on David's shoulder as they stood in the quiet morning light. Her eyes were filled with the same quiet grace that had guided her to offer soup to a ghost in the dark. In the bottom of the box, they discovered a final note written on a scrap of modern stationery. It stated simply that the rent for the night had been paid in full, and that a massive trust fund had been activated in David's name. The struggle that had defined their marriage was over in a single heartbeat. However, the inheritance came with a final directive. The wealth was not meant to build walls of comfort, but to tear down the barriers of suffering. They were to use the Miller fortune to establish a sanctuary for the forgotten, ensuring no man would ever have to beg for a corner in a garage to survive a storm again. David looked out the window at the clearing sky, finally understanding that while the house knew its true master, he had finally learned what it meant to be a man of character, empathy, and compassion for those in need.